Live from Washington, this is BBC News. European leaders meet in Paris to discuss the future of Ukraine. It comes as the US gets ready for its own talks with Russia in Saudi Arabia. And ahead of those talks, the US's top diplomat, Marco Rubio, discusses the future of Gaza with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And a plane flips over on landing in Toronto, leaving 3 people seriously injured. Hello, I'm Ritika Gupta and welcome to the programme. We begin with those emergency talks in Europe on Ukraine's fate as the US gears up to meet with Russian officials on Tuesday in Saudi Arabia. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer says there needs to be a security guarantee from the US to create what he calls a lasting peace in the region. He's planning to continue this discussion with President Donald Trump when he arrives here in Washington next week. European leaders have been holding the emergency summit on Ukraine in Paris to try to come up with a strategy following President Trump's push for a deal with Russia. Our Europe editor Katya Adler has this report.
Europe's biggest military powers scrambling here to Paris last minute shows you how much they believe is at stake. How worried they are that Washington and Moscow might decide this continent's fate without them, unless they take action. Things between the US and Russia seem to be going ahead so fast that leaders here feel they're being left behind. They worry not just about the future of Ukraine, but more broadly in Europe. Today's talks drill down on 2 main issues, both demanded of Europe by Donald Trump. Leaders investing more in their own defence and maybe sending soldiers to Ukraine to safeguard an eventual ceasefire. Some here, like Spain, feel that's premature. The war is still raging. Prime Minister. France and the UK took the lead, we're told. Leaving the meeting, the Prime Minister seemed keen again to be that bridge between Europe and the US.
I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
But thousands of miles away, in what feels like a parallel universe, US envoys arrived in Saudi Arabia today to prepare a path to peace without the UK, Europe or Ukraine. This is the man they're scheduled to meet in the morning, Russia's foreign minister, dismissive as ever earlier about the Europeans.
The European philosophy hasn't gone anywhere, so I don't know what they can do at the negotiating table.
Just about able to contain his frustration, Ukraine's president looked for allies of his own in the Middle East today.
We cannot acknowledge anything, any arrangements about us that were not made with us, and we will not recognise such agreements.
These are Ukrainian recruits being trained by British armed forces in the UK this month. Coordinating on defence now feels existential in Europe. Katya Adler, BBC News, Paris.
And our correspondent Rajini Vaidyanathan sent this update from Paris.
Well, this meeting in Paris was hastily arranged by France's Emmanuel Macron and in many ways came as a response to some of the messaging that we've been hearing from the US government, and of course is a response to the fact that the US and Russia are going to be having their talks about how to end the war in Ukraine, but Europe does not have a seat at the table. So attending these talks in Paris were leaders from key European nations, the German Chancellor, British Prime Minister, Polish Prime Minister, and also Mark Rutte from NATO, for example, and the EU's Ursula von der Leyen. And Ursula von der Leyen, before that meeting began, set out what was at stake. She said Europe's security is at a turning point. Yes, it's about Ukraine, she said, but it's also about us. Now, after that meeting, we didn't get an official readout. We didn't hear from Mr. Macron, but we did hear, for example, from the British Prime Minister, who said that there was no solution without a US backstop. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also conceding that there needed to be no split between the US and Europe. Now, Sir Keir Starmer has confirmed that he is going to be travelling to Washington next week to meet with President Trump, and he believes that he could actually be an important bridge between Europe and America. And after that meeting concludes next week, then Mr. Starmer said he will host a meeting with the same European leaders to carry on the conversation. But of course, nobody really knows where things are going next. Now, on Tuesday, of course, will be that key meeting between the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. And we also have Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky meeting in Turkey with his Turkish counterpart, and he will be in Saudi Arabia later in the week.
And in just a few hours' time, US and Russian officials are due to hold face-to-face talks in Saudi Arabia. That's the first time since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. Next week, Ukraine has not been invited to take part. Our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman is in the Saudi capital, Riyadh.
Well, the travelling American officials are being extremely guarded, both about the terms and the format of these talks. In fact, it was only earlier today that they finally confirmed that the meeting was taking place at all. As for Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, meeting Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman earlier here in Riyadh, he has described the meeting as an opening to a broader conversation. And one of his officials telling me tonight that this should be seen as a first step, in their view, to opening up that conversation, to seeing whether or not they say Russia is serious about talks going ahead, and that this shouldn't be seen as the start of negotiations to end the war. I think some of that is a nod to the waves of anxiety that all of this is sending surging through Europe, particularly about the way this is being carried out. We know that President Zelensky has said that he didn't know about these talks, that he isn't involved in them. Now, the interpretation from the travelling Russian delegation very different. They see this as about restoring relations between Moscow and Washington. And remember what an extraordinary moment we have arrived at here, because after 3 years of Moscow's isolation, led by Washington and broadening out to the West itself, we are now at a moment of the most senior, high-level contact between Russian and American officials in many years here in Riyadh.
Now, a Delta Airlines plane from the United States has crashed and overturned as it came into land at Toronto Airport in Canada. The Delta Airlines plane was arriving from Minneapolis in the United States. All 80 passengers and crew survived, though 18 people needed hospital treatment. 3 people, including a child, have serious injuries. Toronto has been experiencing freezing temperatures and strong winds, as well as 2 heavy snowstorms in the space of a week. The CEO of Toronto International Airport gave this update in the last hour.
Airport emergency workers mounted a textbook response, reaching the site within minutes and quickly evacuating the passengers. We stood up our emergency operations center with Delta Airlines and representatives from fire, police, paramedics, security, and our federal agency partners. Again, there were no fatalities. 17 injured passengers were quickly taken to local area hospitals. At this time, we do not know of any of those passengers having critical injuries.
Joining me now is Dan Ronan, the WTOP anchor, aviation expert, commercial pilot, and a trained air safety investigator. So welcome. I mean, you just heard some moments from the presser there. We've still got limited information, but we saw the horrific images of that jet upside down on a snowy track there. There's no fatalities, but several serious injuries. What stands out to you?
Ritika, the survivability of this crash is really the remarkable thing. This plane struck the runway and then slid down the runway a number of feet, and then apparently flipped over. It looks as though the right wing may have struck either the concrete of the runway or another runway light or something, and then flipped over. The sheer survivability of this is really amazing. The tail section and the wings took the brunt of the impact, and then the fuselage stayed intact. And they were able to get everyone off of that airplane in a very short period of time, so professionally. And, you know, we talk so much about the flight attendants and their role that they have to do. They're not there to serve us drinks or sandwiches or provide for our comfort. They're there that in an emergency situation, they're there to get us off the plane safely. And they and the crew at Pearson Airport this afternoon did a truly remarkable job. It's incredible. The other factor is that plane had what are called 16G seats. They're a high impact seat. They are designed to absorb a great deal of punishment, and they did exactly what they were supposed to do. Truly remarkable.
And Dan, there was blowing snow, very windy conditions. They've had some extreme weather over there. Is that playing part of this? Is that what was problematic here, do you think? And what other things will Canada be investigating looking into this?
The TSB is going to be looking at everything. They will do a deep dive into the flight crew, the maintenance on the airplane itself. But one would think that with conditions as we saw today, that the weather is going to be one of the key issues as well. This plane had what's called a demonstrated crosswind component for landing of 37 knots. There were wind gusts in the area at 40 knots. However, it wasn't a straight crosswind directly over the right wing. It was coming in at about 40 degrees. So the actual crosswind may have been 23, 25 knots. However, they were landing on a runway that was wet and snowy. That runway at Pearson is the longest runway, 11,200 feet. Clearly, they had enough concrete in front of them, but they were doing what's called a crab maneuver, where you actually turn the airplane into the wind so that you reduce the wind that's coming over the airplane so it comes more over the nose. And at the last moment, you turn directly onto the runway. And it's possible that the plane the wing may have hit something, or it may have been a little low and struck the concrete and then rolled over. But truly, again, remarkable work by the flight crew and also remarkable work by the airport crew at Pearson to put that fire out, because a fire on an airplane can be so deadly and can spread so quickly.
Right, and Dan, of course, this comes in the wake of that fatal crash at Ronald Reagan Airport here in Washington, D.C., and other high-profile crashes. Should the public feel safe flying commercially? Should there be more safety precautions in place?
I'd fly tomorrow. Personally, at any given time, we have 9,700 airplanes in the air at any given time. And the safety record of commercial aviation over the last 20 years is really, truly remarkable. We have gone through a difficult stretch here the last 2 or 3 weeks. There's no question about it. And also, there's a lot of questions that are being raised now that the new Trump administration is talking about dismissing some people within the FAA, some of these new probationary employees. There's going to be a lot of discussion about that. But commercial aviation is very safe. Sadly, incidents such as the one that we saw today are rare. But I'd get on an airplane tomorrow and wouldn't have any hesitation about it.
And Dan, can you dig into that a little bit more for us? DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, you were talking about this, the talk of cuts being made at the FAA in the wake of these crashes. What is your reaction to that?
Well, you need redundancy. Much of the aviation system, the navigational aids that are in the aviation system, are in some cases 40, 50 years old, and some of those that were dismissed, that are in the process of being dismissed, are people who are technicians who repair what are called VORs and ILSs. They're technical terms, but they're radio aids that keep the flying system safe. And these people are very, very specialized in what they do. U.S. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia Friday said that he's worried that if we were to see a couple thousand air traffic controllers decide to retire, that the system could be in real trouble. And I think the senator's words need to be heeded. The air traffic control system is already very short, 2,000 or so air traffic controllers, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe closer to 3. But the system is already short ATC controllers. And as we saw just a couple of weeks ago at DCA, air traffic control plays an enormous role in keeping the flying public safe.
All right, and we will keep you updated with the latest. But for now, thank you so much to Dan Ronan, aviation expert.
Thank you.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's look at some other stories making the news. Police have named a woman who was shot dead outside a pub in Kent on Valentine's Day as Lisa Smith, who was 43. Police said they found a vehicle containing a gun on the Queen Elizabeth II bridge, which crosses the River Thames near Dartford. Detectives are investigating the possibility that the suspect entered the water. And the government says it has already met a key election pledge to boost the number of NHS appointments and procedures by 2 million in England in the first year in office. Ministers say the target was achieved between July and November last year. The Prime Minister says the government is not complacent and promised further reforms to deliver faster treatment. There are calls for new safety regulations on the strength of headlights. A survey on car headlights suggests 95% of drivers think they're too bright. More than 1,800 motorists were polled for the research, which was commissioned by the RAC. The Department for Transport says it understands there is increased public concern about headlamp glare. You're live with BBC News. While he's in Saudi Arabia, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also been holding talks with the country's de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. It comes at an awkward time for US-Arab relations following Donald Trump's proposal to have millions of Palestinians out of Gaza to neighbouring countries while the US takes over the territory. That's a plan flatly rejected and almost universally condemned by Arab leaders. In his previous term in office, Mr. Trump pushed hard to get Saudi Arabia to normalise relations with Israel, but that never came to be. The Crown Prince insists he won't do so without an agreement that creates a Palestinian state, something incompatible with Mr. Trump's latest proposals. Meanwhile, Israeli media is reporting that the bodies of some hostages who died in captivity in Gaza will be released by Hamas this week. The release would be in line with the ceasefire agreement, which stipulated the return of the first dead hostages on the 33rd day of the truce.
Well, Israeli media are reporting that Israel is going to receive the first dead bodies of the Israeli hostages handed over by Hamas this Thursday. 4 or possibly 5 dead bodies will be given to Israel and their names released earlier that day. And that would be in addition to the regular weekly exchange of living hostages planned for this Saturday. And there are also reports that next week, possibly next Thursday, would see the release of another 4 or 5 dead bodies of Israeli hostages. This would be the first time that Hamas has actually handed over the dead hostages since the ceasefire agreement came into place. Israeli soldiers had previously retrieved the dead bodies of some hostages, but this would be the first official handover from Hamas. And it would obviously be an extremely painful moment for Israel to see those coffins coming out of Gaza. In exchange for that, we are told, Israel will release all of the women prisoners and those under the age of 19 arrested since the 8th of October 2023, the day after the Hamas attacks on Israel. All of this in line with what the ceasefire agreement had stipulated, which was that the first dead bodies would be handed over on day 33 of the ceasefire deal, which falls this Thursday. But it was up in the air as to whether both sides would stick to that, given the fact that the ceasefire has been very much on tenterhooks over the last few days. I have to say that the Israeli government, the Israeli Prime Minister's office, has not yet confirmed this information, but it's been widely reported in the Israeli media. So the first dead bodies likely to come and to be handed over officially by Hamas to Israel, say the Israeli media, this Thursday.
And I've been speaking to former US State Department advisor Aaron David Miller and asked him if President Trump's plan for Gaza is viable.
It does clearly help Benjamin Netanyahu assuage and pacify the right-wing elements of his government, who have been campaigning from the beginning of the war for depopulating Gaza in an effort to open the door to Israel's resettlement, which the Israelis, as you know, withdrew in 2005. But no, I think the Arab states will probably come up with a plan. Maybe that was part of Trump's Gaza gambit, to sort of get the Arabs to take more responsibility for Gaza, but under no circumstances could I envision voluntary or involuntary transfer of significant numbers of Palestinians in the scores, if not hundreds of thousands, to either Gaza or Egypt. And if the Israelis continue to push this plan, I suspect the Jordanians and the Egyptians will be under great pressure not to violate their treaty obligations with Israel. And but relations are going to seriously be degraded.
And Aaron, we're still just in phase one of the ceasefire deal, which is going to end soon. So when do you think we're going to start to learn more about phase two? And is there wide support from it from both sides? Because I imagine it's a lot more complicated, as this phase would foresee an end to the war.
Impossible for me to imagine right now. And I'll put as optimistic an edge on this as I possibly can. Impossible to imagine that the requirements that Hamas and Israel are obligated to deliver in phase two, that would be the release of the remaining hostages. The Israelis estimate there are roughly 50.
And let's take you live now to Toronto Pearson Fire Chief Todd Aitken. He's briefing the media there following that Delta Airlines plane crash in Toronto. Take a listen.
3 of our stations in the airport operating area responded with 8 aircraft fire and rescue apparatus, plus Mississauga Fire and Emergency Services quickly responded with 6 engines, 2 district chiefs, a command vehicle, and a tanker. Peel Regional Paramedic Services responded with 18 paramedic units. Upon arrival, my team conducted fire suppression. Self-evacuation was already taking place. At this time, we believe all our emergency response went as planned. We will, however, be conducting a review. This is an active investigation. It's very early on. It's really important that we do not speculate. What we can say is the runway was dry and there was no crosswind conditions. We also want to give an update. We can now confirm that 18 injured passengers have been transported to the local area hospitals. We had 1 additional passenger recently transported to a hospital. We will all be supporting the ongoing investigation by the Transportation Safety Board. Thank you to our teams at Mississauga Fire and Emergency Services, Peel Police, and Peel Regional Paramedic Services, and all other responders that responded on the scene. And now we'll be passing it over to Peel Police. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Wahid Butt. I am the Superintendent in charge of the Airport Division, Peel Regional Police. As the police of jurisdiction, we assisted in today's response. We have secured the site and will continue to provide security and offer any assistance needed. We will also like to thank other GTA police services that are assisting us today. Thank you.
Thank you both. There will be no more formal news conferences tonight, but we are scheduled to provide an update tomorrow. We will provide information on that. We will also be posting operational updates on our social medias throughout the night as well. For media who are coming to the airport, we ask that you continue to stage at 311 Convair Drive.
And we just heard there from Toronto Pearson Fire Chief briefing the media that following that Delta Airlines plane crash. They said they're still conducting a review. It's early on, and it's important that they don't speculate. They said that the runway was dry, there was no cross currents. He mentioned that 18 passengers had been transported to hospital. We also just heard from the police there of the jurisdiction, and they will provide more updates for us. Now, let's turn to some other important news around the world. At least 10 people have been killed in the southeastern United States due to storms that brought heavy rains and flooding. 8 people were killed in Kentucky, many of them when their vehicles were trapped in fast-riding waters. The victims included a mother and her child. The Kentucky governor declared a state of emergency and urged people to stay off the roads. He said hundreds of people stranded by the floods had been rescued. The South Korean authorities say they've temporarily suspended the local service of the Chinese artificial intelligence app DeepSeek over concerns about its data collection practices. South Korea's Personal Information Protection Commission said DeepSeek's service would be resumed after improvements and remedies were made in line with privacy laws. Last month, the commission sought clarification from DeepSeek about its data collection and management methods. And opposition politicians in Argentina say they will move to impeach President Javier Milei after his short-lived promotion of an obscure cryptocurrency caused many investors to lose money. The cryptocurrency is called Libra, and the president posted about it Friday. He deleted the post a few hours later, and the value of the currency collapsed. Malay's office says he was not involved in the development of the cryptocurrency and deleted the post to stop speculation about his involvement. And the Pope is currently in the hospital with a respiratory infection. The Vatican says Pope Francis is in a stable condition in hospital and does not have a fever. Earlier on Monday, his doctors had to change his treatment because of what they described as a complex clinical situation. The Pope, who's 88, was admitted 4 days ago with bronchitis. He will remain in hospital for as long as necessary. A spokesman said Francis was in good spirits. And you can check the latest stories online at bbc.com/news or on the app. But thank you so much for watching, and do stay with us here on BBC News. Thank you and goodbye.